Felix, congratulations on the new book. It is the Formations of the Modern Self. Have I got that right?
Formation of the Modern Self, that's it.
And it is published with Bloomsbury, am I right? Yeah. And so I just thought we could begin by talking about the genesis of the work. It struck me as a bit of a departure from your other research because you talk about phenomenology and you talk about the history of ideas. You talk about what was your last book? Was the remind me of the title of your last book, Felix? I clearly very well researched here. It's on the Kairos, wasn't it? That was your first book, was on Kairos, and your second book was on the name of it escapes me, Felix. That's very embarrassing.
The Phenomenology of the Christian Self.
The Phenomenology of the Christian Self. That's the one. Great book. That's it. Yeah. So, do you consider this as a bit of a departure from the other work? It strikes me as a more historical work, or maybe a genealogical work.
Yeah, I mean, well, it's kind of, that's got something to do with its origins, really, because it was never meant. I never meant to write this book. So this was supposed to be the first chapter of another book. The other book that I'm still writing that's not finished yet, and then it just kind of expanded and expanded. But it's supposed to be just kind of, it was supposed to be a book on the phenomenology of the self. That and this was supposed to be the first chapter for just kind of a historical introduction, but it just kind of grew and grew and grew until it became a book on its own. So that's kind of, you know, that's kind of the origin of it. So maybe that's part of what's happened, but it does link into my earlier work in two senses, I think. One, what I'm trying to show is that the problem of God, the phenomenology of religion that I'm working on in the Phenomenology of Christian Life, has its origins within modernity. You know, that you can trace, you know, the kind of the theological turn in contemporary French philosophy. You can trace it right back into the origins of modernity. And so that's kind of, you know, that's kind of what I'm trying to do in this book, because what I do in relation to the self is I try to show that these philosophers are actually very much concerned with what we might call existential problems. You know, they're very much concerned with human happiness and the relationship of that to salvation or to some sort of Christian kind of context. And so that's what I was trying to kind of demonstrate in the book.
Yeah, so it has a distinct time period. You're talking about the early modern period, and you deal with some very specific philosophers. And I don't think we're going to be able to talk about all of them, but you talk in there about Kant, Hume, Montaigne, Pascal, and you also go back to some of the ancient philosophy and some of the Christian philosophy, and you're kind of chasing the origins of this thing we call self. In a similar way, I think, or with different outcome to Charles Taylor, you know, that famous book of his, the Sources of the Self. And you talk about how the self emerged in the early modern period. Now, maybe we could start there. Just what became before the early modern period. So could you speak a little bit about the Christian's origins of the self? There seems to be this drama throughout the book between the Augustinian notion of the self and the Pelagian notion of the self. So could perhaps you talk to that a little bit, Felix?
Sure. I mean, like one of the claims I'm trying to make in the book is that modernity starts in the late medieval world, right? So that modernity didn't kind of just land from nowhere. It was a response to a crisis of medieval thought, right? And we see that even like the very word moderna, you know, the via moderna, it originally was a theological term, right? It had to do with a conflict or a debate between the so-called Via Antiqua and the Via Moderna, right, in 13th century medieval thought. So I mean, so that's the first kind of claim I'm trying to make. But then and then what I'm trying to say is, well, okay, in that kind of there was this kind of crisis that in the medieval world, and people responded to it in different ways. And in terms of the relationship to the self, it was, so to speak, that the problem became, okay, when we're dealing with a crisis, the question became, and that's kind of the distinctly modern question, I think, well, not what, you know, the first question isn't about the crisis itself. The first question is about the one who makes the decision in relation to the crisis, namely the self, right? So that turn back to the self is a turn back to the one who has to make the decision as to how to respond to the crisis that we're in. And of course, for somebody raised within the Christian world, as all of these thinkers were, the key figure is Augustine in this respect, right? Because with Augustine, you have this inner turn within Christianity. In a certain sense, it's implicit within Christian thinking anyway, right? You see it in the Christian scriptures, this kind of emphasis on the inner self as opposed to external observance. But in Augustine, it becomes very crucial, and because the path to God for Augustine is one within. You move, from the external world into the inner self, and then to the divine. The question then becomes, what is the status of that self? And for Augustine, he says two main things about it. One is that the self becomes the self we know through a free act, namely the free act of, or let me put that a little bit differently. It comes to the self we know because of freedom, because the human being was free. It had the possibility to turn away from God, what the whole Adam and Eve story, what we call the fall, and so on, the fall into sinfulness. And Augustine claimed from that, and on the basis of his own experience of himself, that left an indelible mark on the human self, such that the self was never able to regain its kind of primordial state, the state that it was before it fell into sinfulness. And only through divine grace could it be lifted up back into that kind of primordial, essential human being that God created, that was the human being that God intended it to be. And so that was so that's kind of the Augustinian kind of, if you like, a kind of a pessimistic view of the human self, right? That human self is characteristic by powerlessness, by incapacity. And against that you had Pelagius, who, we don't know where he came from, probably from what is now Britain, the island of Britain. He was a religious leader at his time, and he said, no, this isn't the case. That the human being has the capacity to be good, has the capacity to be pleasing to God, and that the Christian should be without sin, right? And the Christian has the capacity to be without sin. Doesn't need divine grace. That grace is already given. He does need divine grace, yes, but that grace is already given to him or her to achieve goodness. And that's a more optimistic view, right? That the human being has the capacity within themselves to reach their own salvation. So those were the two kind of conflicting views of the self, one more pessimistic, one optimistic, that I think lie at the very origins of modernity.
And with regard to that drama, it's not like the drama goes away. It's like, I think that's the thesis of it in the book, that these two forces play out in different contexts across the birth of the modern self, especially across the formation of the modern self in the early modern period. And modern philosophy itself then seems to be working on this clear distinction between an epistemological neutral subject and a moral subject, which harks back to that distinction between the Pelagian and the Augustinian. And the way you stage that opposition between the theoretical and the practical self, I think, has a much longer lineage, which is your point. But in some sense, I think you're saying that opposition is not resolved. Is that right?
Yes, but also I'm not sure it's an opposition to but because I think one of the things I'm trying to kind of attack in this book is a certain view of modernity that wants to say, okay, what we get in modernity is this kind of turn to the epistemological self with Descartes. Becomes a foundational subject, and that this is somehow to be kind of separated out from the moral, political context. And what I want to say is, no, I think that if you understand it in terms of happiness, and I think all of these philosophers I talk about, like from Montaigne to Kant, are all very much concerned with human happiness. And if you see it in that context, the so-called epistemological self is a response to how can human beings be happy, right? And this leads to the kind of the other kind of side of what I'm trying to talk about here, the stoic and the skeptical within the self, right? That the epistemological kind of what what drives the epistemological is the drive for certainty. And the drive for certainty is what is going to bring happiness. And that's the conflict between the skeptics and the Stoics, right? The skeptics think that certainty is not attainable, and that we should live in uncertainty, and that's kind of where Montaigne really becomes that voice of skepticism in the modern era. That he says, look, you can live with uncertainty, and that's actually good. That brings you happiness. It brings you, you live with all this diversity of different ways of being. And you have no certainty as to which is right and which is wrong, but all you know is your own experience of these things.
Yeah, I'd like to talk to you about Montaigne, and I think I will. I mean, I'm not going to be able to talk about all these figures with you, but I definitely want to focus on Montaigne and the role of skepticism. Now, just before we get to Montaigne, and I think there's kind of Montaigne Descartes seems to be two sides of this, of the Augustinian and Pelagian working out. As you put it there, you're trying to criticize the view we teach in philosophy 101 in some sense, about the shift to the modern, where we get this shift from the created being that is created by God in the medieval period, and the hierarchy of being and all that, everything that we teach in first year philosophy, to the idea that the self becomes the God, that that the self is the self creator, or the self is understood in terms of self-authorship. Is that right?
That's the context, right? I mean, it's that movement from, as you say, I mean, the kind of dependence on God on the one hand, to a much more self-creative kind of view of the self. It's just, I think, that it's not at all a clear-cut move, and even when we get to Kant, that's the end of my story here. It's not at all clear-cut that we've reached a kind of a self-creating self.
Okay, now let's talk a little bit about Montaigne then. And Montaigne is, well, you've alluded to it already, and it's how this notion of skepticism is taken up, because Montaigne is a great skeptic, as is Descartes. You don't get Descartes without his casting a skeptical eye on the existence or non-existence of the external world. But Montaigne is a figure who plays a big part for you. And for Montaigne, as you pose it, the Montaignian self is a judging self, right? And you have him kind of cast as I like it because he's a proto-phenomenologist, right? And things are as they appear to him, or that is a common denominator of the self. All selves start thinking that what appears to them is true, right? And then we can, assess the relative merits of that after the fact, but that's where we are in the world. I see a forerunner of Hegel here as well. I've been teaching Hegel this year in the Phenomenology of Spirit, where all humans begin in self-certainty. And, what you see is what you get effectively. But, that's just the beginning for Montaigne in the modern self. He's such an important figure because it's the skepticism he brings to that immediate world of appearance, to the immediate world of uncertainty, and then after that, he goes, the self is generated by all of these. He's almost sort of proto-postmodernist. The self is generated out of social context by natural inclination and circumstance and tradition. And that's how the self comes to be. So I suppose my question then is firstly, have I characterized Montaigne right there for you? And is there anything you'd like to add to that?
Yeah, I mean, yes, I mean, I think so. I mean, I think that is exactly where Montaigne stands, and I think he's. But what's so crucial about him is precisely to say that move from self-certainty to that kind of tranquil acceptance of diversity, right? Because like one of the crucial things he says is that the big mistake is to judge the other in terms of the self, right? That's a fundamental mistake, right? And so you see it in, for example, I mean, his most famous essay on cannibalism, right? Where it's like, okay, so based on our kind of, and it's very well written because structurally, because basically he's tackling the view that the cannibals are savages, right? They're the savages and we're the ones that are civilized, and so we have the standard by which to judge them. And in the end, what you see is it gets reversed, right? He shows that we are just as much savages, if not more so, we being we Europeans, as the cannibals are, right? And so in other words, so all we have for him is our own experience. But what we have to recognize is that that experience is one perspective among a myriad of perspectives.
So you would say he's a skeptic rather than a moral relativist?
Oh, goodness. Well, I mean, in a certain sense, he's a moral relativist. I mean, in the sense that, it's a. I would say he's a more moral relationalist rather than a moral relativist, if that's a term, right? In the sense that he has a sense of justice, right? He has a sense of, I mean, almost in a Derridian sense, right? There's a sense of justice there that's kind of a guide, right? That is in a certain sense undeconstructible in his terms, or in Derridian terms. But looked into Montaigne. But what you have then is you have the self looking at, because like all these essays are like this kind of very curious in the sense of guided by curiosity, exploration of this diversity of ways of doing things, and the recognition that not one of them can claim to be the fully right one. His famous thing about the other side of the river, like this side of the river, I'm not allowed to kill, right? The other side of the river, if
those guys terrible.
yeah, exactly. If the king orders me to do it, then I'm obliged to kill, and so it's like, how does that make sense? Well, it only makes sense if it's so that there are kind of particular societies, particular groups, particular communities we belong to, and they're guided by logic of self and other.
Is it the case then that for Montaigne, that skeptical self, it's irreducible, that we find ourselves in a world full of appearance, full of traditions, customs, and opinions, and we cannot but be moral relativist, but because of that, because that's sort of the fact of the matter almost, the fact is moral relativism, which is a slightly sort of paradoxical formulation, I think you follow me, but it's for Montaigne, an acknowledgement of that, an acceptance of that is morally productive, psychologically healthy. Is that the thought?
I think so, because I mean it gives you a sense of tolerance, right? And Montaigne, and that's why I say there's a sense of justice going right through his work, because he's appalled by what the Europeans are doing in the Americas, and he's appalled because they are doing what he says you can't do, namely they're judging the other by the self, right? So they're saying, they're different from us, therefore they're inferior to us, therefore we can treat them as we like, right? And he's saying, no, I mean it's and that, if you want to call it moral relativism, is morally productive in the sense that it says, no, we have to tolerate the other, we have to tolerate other ways of life, because we have no groundstone, we have no basis for making the claim that we know better than they do.
So it's an ethical injunction to agree to disagree, basically, in kind of a way, or allowing that to be part of your psychological makeup. So the idea that sort of, in some sense, accepting uncertainty is constituted of a healthy, productive self. I guess that's his contribution to the formation of the modern self, Felix.
Exactly, but I would say there's a dynamic in it, right? So it's not just to agree to disagree. It's that you learn from your encounter with the others, right? So you learn from how they see you. And so there's a dynamic there. There's a development there that you can see working through the essays. I think once when you see the essays in their chronological order, you can see how Montaigne sees the self as learning and becoming clearer about itself precisely through its interaction with others.
And then along comes Descartes. So we should talk about Descartes, who is another version of skepticism. I think he's another version of skepticism, and I think the move in Descartes it's a move from the outside to the inside and back to the outside again. So it's from he rejects the testimony of the senses, he rejects the testimony of the external world. This is the common story, at least, and then he finds the cogito, He finds clear and distinct ideas, and he goes on to the proofs of God's existence and the idea of the infinite, and then he reestablishes the foundation, and he understands the self and the outside. Now, the story we often tell about Descartes is, he's the guy who gave us dualism, right? So internal and external world shall never meet. I think you're telling a more complicated story about Descartes, and that Descartes' skepticism too has a similar injunction to Montaigne. Descartes' skepticism is morally productive. It's directed towards the good in some sense, rather than just being an epistemological claim. Have I got that right, Felix, or am I doing justice to your position?
Yeah, no, absolutely, absolutely. But I think, I think he differs from Montaigne in very kind of important ways. The first thing is, I think we have to read him in that context, right? We have to read Descartes in terms as responding to Montaigne. And I think he responds to him. I think for him, Montaigne is it's crucial that he overcomes Montaigne, because what he sees is that Montaigne's view will undermine science in the way Descartes wants to develop the scientific. And I think that influences the different skepticisms as well. Montaigne's skepticism isn't accepting skepticism, right? It's accepting that we cannot get beyond our own experience of the world, and that's okay for Montaigne. That
right.
Indeed, that gives you diversity. That gives you a life that's interesting and that's aesthetically pleasing. But Descartes comes along, and skepticism for him is anxiety producing. It is disturbing, right? I think this is really, like, when you see it in its historical context, it becomes really interesting, right? Just to say a word about the ancient skeptic for a minute, the Pyrrhonian strand of skepticism, which I think is the dominant, the important strand when it comes to early modernity, is one that says what happens for the skeptic is true skeptical reflection. They reach a state of aporia. They reach a state where they realize that they can neither make a clear judgment one way or the other, and that gives them tranquility. And you get that sense in Montaigne, right? That sense that, I can never know whether my way of understanding things is the right way. It gives me a sense of tranquility for him. But Descartes, you read up to the end of the first meditation and into the second meditation, and it's what we often, when we teach him, we often kind of skip over.
Yeah, we do indeed. Yeah,
is that sense of anxiety? He talks about being in a whirlpool, right, at the beginning of the second meditation. Those aren't just literary kind of things that he's thrown in there. It's those descriptions of his state of mind are really important. Because what he's saying to us is, no, skepticism doesn't bring you tranquility. Montaigne is wrong. It doesn't give you it doesn't bring you tranquility. It brings you anxiety. It brings you a disturbance in the soul. And so the only way to cure that, and the only way to get to happiness, is to find certainty. As he puts it, that Archimedean point, right? And so that's for me is crucial. Then is that's the guiding the guiding kind of inputs, and indeed, just to throw that forward a bit more further, the impulse behind science for Descartes is not fundamentally a kind of a neutral, wanting to know truth for truth's sake. No, it's in order to control nature. It's in order to control our world in such a way that we can be happy. And he doesn't, because of the political context, he doesn't kind of stress the political side of that. But I think the politics is very much there as well, right? It's not just about basing our science on certainty. It's also basing our politics on that. And so what you get is a very different world to Montaigne. Then you don't get a world of diversity. You get a world that is uniform, basically, right? And again, right, the whole idea at the beginning of the discourse, right, of the architect, right, who will build, like, the city planner or whatever, who you want the city that's built by one is going to be better than built by many. Because you have unity there, you've got it based on certainty.
You got your foundation.
And you've got your foundation, exactly. Yeah, but the crucial thing is, right, that again, we tend to read that in a kind of a purely epistemological sense, whereas I think it's very much an ethical, very much a political, and very much about controlling the world and controlling nature.
The other figure there, who you in the book you do mention, but perhaps he's not the biggest figure, is Bacon, I guess. Francis Bacon. He would be a figure, that. And I can see the overlap there with Descartes, at least the sort of the epistemological overlap, where the idea is to very much dominate nature, to control nature, to put nature towards the uses and instruments of man, basically. And it's very much the idea that it's a human-centric account of the self.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, Bacon is within the same context, and the whole kind of, and Bacon is even more explicit, right? That whole kind of he uses quite violent metaphors in order to kind of to express this. But what's weird about that is it's almost, and that's kind of what I tried to say about Descartes as well. It's almost this kind of strange inversion of Stoicism, right? Because what the idea is that that nature, if you can control the natural world, if you can control that kind of area of uncertainty, you kind of widen out the power of the self. And I mean, the Stoics, the basic idea in Stoicism, in ancient Stoicism, and this is kind of simplifying a lot, but basically is that you only get happiness in the domain that you have power, right? So and for the Stoics, of course, you only have power within yourself, right? So you only have power within your own emotional response to the world. You don't have power in anything outside. What I think you see happening in Descartes, you see it happening in Bacon, is that Stoicism becomes, so to speak, extended. The self becomes extended out. So it's kind of like, well, no, if we can control the natural world, then we can have happiness within that world, because we're able to determine it, and we're able to kind of eliminate those kind of what slings and arrows of outrageous fortune that cause us unhappiness.
Now, the other philosophers that we need to talk about is Spinoza and Hume. You spend a lot of time talking about. I mean, you devote an entire chapter to talking about Spinoza and Hume together, and that's, for starters, to me, that's an interesting, putting those two together is an interesting, because we, again, when we teach philosophy in first years, usually, Spinoza, Leibniz, the rationalist, Locke and Hume, the empiricist, and they disagree with each other, so it's Descartes, Spinoza, Leibniz on one side, vying against Locke and Hume and Adam Smith on the other side, and along comes Kant and brings them all together. That's the story we tell. So let's maybe start with that. Like, why do you put these two together? Usually they're not put together. So where do they fit in with your story of the self? I'm guessing it's going to be something to do with skepticism, especially with Hume, but we'll take things from there, Felix.
Yeah, I mean, well, first of all, I'm trying to kind of get away from that whole history, right? I'm trying to get away from the empiricist rationalist kind of thing. And not that there's not a certain truth to it, obviously there is, but it's very much a kind of a post-Kantian kind of reading back into that tradition. It's kind of like Kant unites them. Well, okay, there must be something that had to get united, right? So we go back and we read them in those terms. But I think if you look at them in their own terms, they were always in dialogue with one another, right? There's always this discourse happening back and forth, and Spinoza, I think, was quite important for Hume, right? I mean, Hume doesn't acknowledge it because, of course, Spinoza in the early 18th century was a very ambiguous figure, right? So you didn't want to be associated with Spinoza. So and indeed Hume kind of attacks him directly, but I think that's kind of subterfuge really on Hume's part. But in any case, where do I see the connection? I see a lot of connections between them. I mean, in relation, it's almost, I mean, I begin at the beginning saying, one is a philosopher expression, one is a philosopher of impression, right? And it's like they're almost mirror opposites of one another. I think if you read Spinoza saying, okay, take the Spinoza view, right, of the world, then make the claim that the only thing we can know is through our senses, right? You get Hume talking very kind of basic terms. But if you take away the third form of knowledge that for Spinoza is key, right? The third form of knowledge is one where reason kind of intuits the eternal structure of the world. If you say that's impossible, then I think that you're thrown back into a kind of into a human world. So a world where, yes, we live in a deterministic world, right? But we're not. But that determinism is one we cannot justify except through custom and so on. We live in a world where we experience passions, and those passions, how do we kind of negotiate them? Well, we try to make them as calm as possible, which is like the Humean approach, right? I mean, we make the passions as calm as possible in order thereby to bring us into a state of some sort of tranquility, which again is Spinoza's aim, right? Spinoza wants the sense of happiness for Spinoza is that we end up in a realm of tranquility. Except for Spinoza, that happens through through this kind of, as I say, this third form of knowledge, this purely rational kind of intuitive knowledge, which Hume thinks is impossible.
And in Hume, then, well, I really like what you do with Hume in this, because Hume is, he's a great figure of the Scottish Enlightenment, and he's usually cast as a figure who brings philosophy back down to earth. Philosophy, it's, like you say, it's the impressions. All I can know is what's immediately apparent to me. So I can now hear the echo of Montaigne there as well. Now, with Hume, there's an interesting move going on, because of course Hume says that the self is not, there's no self really, isn't there, for Hume? Or there's no self behind the curtain. There's nothing backstage ordering all this flux of impressions. Like I forget the famous quote from Hume that the self is a bundle of perceptions and that they all bypass each other in inconceivable rapidity and flux. I mean, he put it obviously a lot more eloquent than that, but that is the thought, right? But I like what you do with Hume. So your Hume is a bit more of a phenomenologist. He's more like Husserl. He's very much important for the modern inductive and experimental idea. The idea that all knowledge is derived from the senses, and the senses are the foundation of induction and experimentation and observation and the modern scientific method, basically. But for you, I mean, that you do acknowledge that's there. But for you, Hume is more concerned with how we live in the world, the phenomenological. So Hume tests philosophical claims against the observation of experience as it occurs. So there's no abstraction there, right? There's no abstraction of the scientific method, and that self is a very, very different type of self for Hume. And so I'm wondering then, like, how then do you? Because Hume also is a sort of a liberatory figure for you, I think. He tries to, by returning to experience, we can liberate the self in some way. So we liberate the self from the self. Is that right?
Yeah, no, I think that's a good way of putting it. I mean, like, first of all, just in terms of phenomenology, absolutely. I mean, Husserl would say to his students, read Hume. Husserl wasn't one for, sending his students to the history of philosophy that much, but Hume, for him, from beginning to end, was an important philosopher. And I think Husserl sees something very important in Hume that is, as I say, kind of proto-phenomenological. I mean, if I can start at the beginning with your first point about the self, you're absolutely right, except that when you go from the first to the second book of the treatise, it's so interesting, right? The first book of the treatise is precisely as you say, right? Like, I look into myself, I find nothing but perceptions, there is no self, and so on, right? Then suddenly in the second treatise, self's all over the place, right?
Imagination, yeah.
Well, not just imagination, but in terms of the passions, right? In terms of, like, he starts off talking about passions, right? Talking about pride and so on. And you can only understand that in terms of a self, right? I mean, if I'm feeling pride, what am I feeling pride about? I'm feeling pride about either myself or something that's associated with me. And so this is where I think Spinoza and Hume are very interesting to see together, because I think what's going on there is that what we get in Hume, as we do in Spinoza, is a relational concept of the self, right? So what Hume is denying is that there's a self in the kind of substantial way in which Descartes understood it, right?
Yeah, there's no homunculus there, right?
Exactly. There is no homunculus, but that's not to say that the notion of the self is somehow ridiculous or meaningless. No, but what it is it's only in relation to others. It's only in that relational context that we make sense of the self, right? So it's not at all surprising that Hume brings in this notion of the self when he's talking about the passions, in a way, as I said, very similar to Spinoza. So yeah, I mean, I think Hume is a very kind of liberating figure here. As you say, he's a skeptic. He brings that Montaigne's skepticism forward, and again, not in the way that Descartes does, right? It's not as this anxiety-producing thing, but rather is precisely liberating, right? It's precisely understanding that the self, through its skepticism, recognizes that all it can really talk about is its own experience. But again, in talking about experience, it does experience itself. It doesn't experience itself in the theoretical way that we get it from somebody like Descartes.
Right, so for Hume, then the wisdom of the self is found in, I think you put it in these terms even, it's found in relation, found in communication, found in dialogue with the everyday, with the vulgar, whatever, if I want to use those. I want to use that in a non-pejorative sense, that term, that the point of, for Hume, and that's why it's so interesting, the point of philosophical reflection, as he does, and he too retreats into the self, like, it's the impressions, I get you, the impressions make an imprint on the self. They leave a trace. But what's healthy then for a self is to habituate itself to the forms of thinking, that, and the patterns that it finds in its everyday life. And that's why I suppose he's in that common sense philosophical tradition. How he has some skin in the game, as they say.
Absolutely. I mean, like he's always like Hume's always kind of thinking about this kind of move from the philosophical, as you say, to the everyday, right? And it's interesting as well. He thinks of it in terms of kind of like boredom and pleasure and so on, right? It's kind of like that you get, you want to go out and have drinks with your buddies and have fun and flirt and all of these things. You want to do that. But then it kind of gets boring, right? And there's a sense in the self that needs to reflect, right? But that philosophical reflection as well, it gets too much. And so Hume is very kind of again, I mean, he's very concrete in these terms, right? He's very much talking about, and that's part of kind of the context I'm trying to say in this book is that, and we get it very clearly in Hume, but I think we get it in all of them, that there's two kind of related ways in which the self comes into these philosophers. One is their kind of reflections upon what the self is, but the other is the kind of the operational or implied concept of the self, right? That there's an implied notion of the self that's working through their texts. I think you can see that right from with Montaigne, you can see it in Descartes and so on, Pascal and so on. But in Hume it kind of becomes quite explicit. I think that kind of move from the self that is thinking, right? It is reflecting, that is living, to the self as the kind of the concept which he develops about what it is to be a self.
Yeah, and that makes sense to me. I mean, I see, and I don't think this is too, I don't think this is. I'm reading Edmund Burke a lot at the moment, and they were contemporaries as far as I recall, Hume and Burke, and that there is that sense. I mean, you can call it conservative view life of that where skepticism is directed towards the limitations of what a self can and cannot be. It's kind of almost like the finitude of the self. That's one of Hume's famous messages, isn't it? Like, reason is the slave of the passions. We can reason, but we have to understand it within the domains of the emotions and the passions. And there is, within that, I think this is one of your claims as well, that's a normative claim as well. It's an epistemological claim, that's how it is, but that's also how it ought to be. The self exists in this flux of impressions, but it also strives to to sustain itself, to maintain itself, to persevere, despite all that alteration and change and historical fortune. There's slings and arrows of outrageous fortune. We keep coming back to Shakespeare. That's one of the great modern accounts of the self.
Absolutely, but precisely, and I mean, it's something I try to do is kind of take that notion of the stage, right, from Shakespeare, that he of course takes from the Stoics, that sense that the world is a stage, right, where we all have parts, and we're all kind of within this kind of this drama. And again, I mean, for Hume, it's the passions, because, like, in the end, because we have skin in the game, as you say, right? And the skin in the game is our need, our seeking after happiness in the end, right? And so and for Hume wants to say, well, reason only works in that context. Reason doesn't give us the end, right? Reason doesn't give us the goal. It's our way of kind of working towards that goal. And what's really interesting, just to put that in, because it often gets kind of passed over in Hume, is how he understands animals in that respect, right? And how he understands the animal as we're not being fundamentally different from the animal in that respect, right? That animals too have that kind of seeking after what will give them pleasure and give them peace and so on, and work in a way that's at least analogous to our reasoning in order to reach that. And that I think is really interesting in Hume, right? That he really tries to make us concrete, but also tries to kind of get rid of these kind of the sense of human being as being somehow essentially distinct from other beings in nature.
Right, so the human being shares its nature with nature, which distinguishes them, I suppose, from Descartes and Bacon. I'm hearing a lot of, I think you make a convincing argument, because I'm hearing a lot of the ancient messages in here. There's some very old questions in here, like, there's the one and the many, how can there be change? And, where there is change, how do we find stability and continuity, or the same and difference? So all these questions are playing themselves out again. And where else does that play itself out? In the head, more so than in Kant, right? So I thought I'd give you an opportunity, because I realize we've packed a lot in here, Felix. And it's a testament to how good the book is, because there's so much in there to talk about. But I just want to give you an opportunity to talk about Kant and where does he fit in this story, And I think the way you do it, and correct me if I'm wrong, it's this story of, it's kind of conversion story, really, isn't it? It's about inner conversion, and inner conversion in conjunction with outer cooperation. I think that's how you put it. And it's and what binds that together is not so much Kant's critique, or the first critique where he talks about the transcendental aesthetic and all that, but more his moral philosophy. It's a kind of a common commitment to the good. That's the big significant moment in Kant's thesis of the self. And he internalizes that skepticism in order to establish, well, the kingdom of Inns, I guess.
Absolutely. I mean, I think one of the problems with reading Kant is that, and indeed, I think it's a problem reading a lot of the modern philosophers, is that we cherry pick what we think are the crucial works, right? So with Descartes, for example, we in the English-speaking world, not so much in the French-speaking world, kind of ignore the passions of the soul for the most part, right? And Descartes becomes the Descartes of the Meditations. Similarly with Kant, right? I mean, we'll kind of we look at the first critique. And then after that, it becomes, well, yeah, okay, it's kind of interesting, but it's really not crucial. Or then, the second critique is important, but then, like, critique of judgment, he's really gone off the rails. And, and whatever about, religion within the bounds of reason, of mere reason, then he's kind of like, clearly gone senile, and we can ignore that, right? And people, some commentators explicitly do question whether he's really got all the marbles together when he's writing the religion book at the end, right? Which I think is really problematic way of reading any philosopher, particularly Kant, because what crucial to Kant is to recognize that the critiques were simply laying the groundwork for for the metaphysics he wants to write. Right. I mean, Kant in the end wants to give us a post-critical metaphysics. He'll talk about the critical age as the age, so to speak, of transition, right? It's a transition to enlightenment, and enlightenment is not post-metaphysical in the way we tend to think of it now. It's rather a critical metaphysics, right? It's a metaphysics that develops, having done the critical work that he has already done in the critique. So that, I think, is really, that to me is fundamental to reading Kant. And so the Kant that I kind of see here is not really the Kant that kind of marries the empiricists and the rationalists. To me, it's a Kant who gives us an account of how to be a self within the world where reason is finite, but where we have a world that works in terms of natural laws, and that is created by a divine creator who unifies or brings together the moral and the laws of morality and the laws of the natural world. And that's, and that, as I see it, is kind of like the end of this story, is that attempt that he gives us. And that's why, I have 2 chapters on Kant, but the second one is almost fully on that religion book, because I think it's actually where he kind of gives us a summing up of this. And like, as you say, the Kingdom of Ends then is this kind of is his kind of historical account where we work towards, or we come towards this world, but this world, this end world, and this brings us back to Augustine, is one we can only reach through the grace of God, right? And what's what I think is really interesting is, like, I think Kant is really the last philosopher who writes about grace, so to speak, without blushing. Right. I mean, he really thinks that philosophically we and with all the caveats, right, that we can't talk about it, and we don't know that, we don't even know there's such a thing as grace. We don't even know there's such a thing as God, right? In that narrow sense of knowledge. But our whole metaphysics, our whole philosophy depends upon a moral fate. And that moral fate is in that God who is, in the end, for Kant, the only guarantor of our moral goodness, our moral salvation, right? Because for Kant, and his rigorism in morality is such that he wants to say we can never be fully justified once we transgress the moral law, right? It's got the way I try to explain it when I teach this is that for Kant, we have no currency to pay back what our misdeeds, right? Because what we ought to do is follow the moral law, and so we can't, so to speak, do that excessively. We simply do that, right? So if, as you say, it's a conversion story, but if from the conversion to the moral law to the end of one's life, one simply never transgresses the moral law, one still hasn't paid back all the transgressions one did before, right? Because you have no currency. You've literally got no money to do it, because you've simply done what you were supposed to do, nothing more. So how can you pay back for your transgressions of the past? And the only, he thinks, he says this quite explicitly, that the only thing is kind of a hope in the grace of God. The grace of God will somehow, recoup that transgression. And this is a very Augustinian moment. And again, I don't think this is recognized enough. This is a very Augustinian moment in Kant, right? To go back to the beginning of our conversation, it's almost as if he's a Pelagian right up till kind of like he's almost at the end, and then he has to become an Augustinian, because only that appeal to divine grace will allow him to complete the story of the self, as that self that is finally saved. And that's my picture of Kant. And like, I mean, it's not a popular picture of Kant at all, right? But if you read his work, you read his 3 critiques, right? It's not by accident that he ends up with God in each of the 3 of them, right? That's not an accident that's the case, and it's not an accident that the final work he's working on, the final work he publishes is on religion, because again, like, if you think of his 3 questions, right? The question, what can I hope for, is the last, and in a sense, the least well motivated, right? I mean, if you understand Kant in the traditional way we understand him, right? We understand why he wants to know what wants to understand about knowledge. We understand why he wants to know about goodness, about what we ought to do. But why hope? Why does hope come in there? It's because I think he's looking for that final kind of metaphysical unity of practice and of theory, of the internal and the external, of the mechanical and the purposeful, and he can only get that by hope in a divine being that whose existence he cannot prove, but who has to be the orientation of his philosophical trajectory.
I think we've been talking for about an hour now, so just under an hour. So I thought we perhaps should bring things to a close. But I'm thinking, have you any thoughts on the self that comes after that modern period? You know, I mean, I was reading Robert Brandam's book on Hegel recently, and I mean, he basically says, we think of the postmodern period happened in 1945, roughly from there on. Brandam, says actually no, the postmodern period starts with Hegel. So I'm wondering, what are your thoughts on that? On the self ahead. What does the self look like after Kant? Or have you had any thoughts of that? Like, what does the self look like for Hegel? What does it look like for Marx or the economic self and so on?
That's the difficult question, right? I mean, my sense of this is that the kind of the story of the self that I try to chart, right? This kind of I call it it's four faces of the self, right? The kind of the Stoic, the skeptic, the Augustinian, the Pelagian. That kind of comes into a certain unity in Kant. I think that unity begins to be chipped away at after Kant, right? I mean, that kind of way in which he understands the self in relation to that kind of finitude and so on, first gets attacked obviously by Schelling and Hegel in their kind of in their attempt to kind of like overcome the critical philosophy, or at least the subjectivism, the critical subjectivism of Kant. And then obviously, right, in terms of the postmodern period, there's almost kind of a returning back to that kind of Montaignean self, right? I think you mentioned before that Montaigne seems very kind of like postmodern. I think you're right. I mean, I think that kind of fragmented kind of self that we get within postmodernity is very much kind of appealing back to that. To me, this postmodern kind of era is one in which we kind of dissect that modern self, right? That said, modern self gets kind of dissected, gets broken up, gets reconceptualized. But I don't see anything. I don't think there's a fundamental change there. I think it's more kind of a critical reflection upon modernity. But from my point of view, what we really need now to think about is the era that begins in 1945 or possibly before, but certainly with at the latest in 1945 with with Hiroshima, and that's kind of what we now begin to call the Anthropocene. If the modern self is being formed in relation to and in response to the crisis of the medieval world, then I think we're very much in the time of the crisis of the modern world. To take just one example, right? I mean, the kind of, as I read it, that kind of Stoic kind of move in Descartes and as you say in Bacon as well, where we control the nature through controlling ourselves, right? This kind of ascetic move back into the self that then is kind of moves out into a control of nature, and that on the one hand, and then the way in which that kind of gets spelled out in that division between nature and culture, nature and society, that Bruno Latour, for example, has very clearly deconstructed. That at the latest in 1945, we recognize that that's no longer viable. That concept of the self in relation to nature is no longer viable. And so, just to finish the point, I think so. To me, the question, certainly the question I'm battling with at the moment, is how do we understand the self today? How do we understand the self in terms of the Anthropocene, right? How do we understand the self in relation to nature? And indeed, I want to say in relation to the divine, but that's another story.
One last thought there, Felix. The question of technology, does that come in there? I mean, you are a Heideggerian in training and in writing, So is the contemporary self then a technological self, or does that fit into the Augustinian and the Pelagian model that you've constructed?
Absolutely. I mean, I think it is, but again, I mean, it's the how we understand that then today and how the moderns understand it is going to be different, right? I mean, because, and I think that's Heidegger's big kind of insight, that the presupposition of modernity is a kind of an instrumentalized view of technology, right? Where the technological becomes that which allows us to control nature, and so it becomes kind of our the instrument of the self in respect to the non-self, in respect to the natural world. But of course, as Heidegger very clearly sees, right, that what technology does, in fact, it reconceptualizes what it is to be, including what it is to be a human being, and we see that so clearly today, right? I mean, these utopian dreams, and again, I mean, the utopian dreams that we see already in Descartes of that somehow through science we get to immortality, right? And Descartes' view, right, you get it through some sort of scientific methodology that gives you the way to of medically controlling things such that you can put off death to indefinitely, or at least for a long period. Now it's kind of like, well, we'll put ourselves up in the cloud, right? We'll
the transhumanist self, yeah.
Exactly. We'll somehow be able to find immortality through technologies, whether it's through the cloud or other means. And it's kind of like, but what's interesting about that is, right, again, it's that shift of the utopia, right? The utopian dream on the one hand, and Descartes, it's very much an instrumental way, right? Through our use of technology, we instrumentalize in such a way that we can protect ourselves from death. In the transhuman way, understanding it, we kind of merge with our technology in order to reach that immortality. And I'm just reading at the moment Gunther Anders, who I would really recommend to anybody to read. It's just unfortunately so little of him has been translated, but some has. But actually, Babbitt Babbage has a really good book out with Bloomsbury on him just recently. But Anders, is really good on talking about this, right? He talks about our shame in relation to our technology, right? That we feel ashamed in terms of our technology, right? Because we judge our technology as somehow superior to us, right? That we talk about the human factor, right? The human factor is a flaw, right? And so if we could just merge with this technology, right, we would
the self is the aberration, then, yeah.
Yeah, well, yeah, exactly. I mean, the human self becomes an aberration, right? And we have to somehow transcend, right? But again, I mean, I think this is a residue, a leftover from modernity. But what it is it's that strange kind of thing that happens in history, right? That modern notion of the self gets kind of transformed and transmuted into this kind of transhumanist kind of view of this kind of technological or technologicalized self.
I think that's a good place to end it. We've moved from early Christianity to the transhumanist robotic self and the posthumanist self. So Felix, just before you go, so thanks very much for joining us. Where is the book available? The Formation of the Modern Self, or the Formation of the Self?
Well, from all from Amazon or from any of the normal kind of online retailers, and I'm sure from other retailers as well. I haven't kept up to date onto exactly where it's on the shelves, but it's out there, and it just got published with Bloomsbury in January.
Yeah, I'll put a link up in the show notes. So thanks again, Felix. That was absolutely fantastic.
Thank you, Pat. That was great. Lots of fun.